area. But, you also recently pointed out something that I thought was really interesting, which was this quote from Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was, of course, at the State Department under Jimmy Carter, was like a foreign policy elite, whose ideas are still very much present in American policy around the world. And the quote that you highlighted was, this is from Zbigniew Brzezinski, not you. But the most dangerous scenario for America would be an anti-hegemonic coalition united not by ideology, but by complementary grievances. And when I saw that, I thought to myself, isn't this what's happening today? Like, that is, you actually do have a growing coalition of countries. And of course, here I'm thinking of countries like China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba. These are countries that have almost nothing in common ideologically. Like, maybe Venezuela and Cuba do, but certainly Iran, Russia, these places all have very different forms of government, very different economic systems, very different ideologies that form the basis of their societies. But they have been brought together by shared grievances, particularly when it comes to issues of sanctions and just, U.S. aggression towards them in various ways. So I guess, my question is, how does this relate, do you think, this quote I just mentioned from Zbigniew Brzezinski, to the policy goal of preventing this like Eurasian integration of Europe with Russia and China, which is really at the end of the day, what this entire US policy around Ukraine, around Taiwan is all about, right? Is to prevent this natural integration of these various geographic areas of the world, which of course Zbigniew Brzezinski was a staunch opponent of. So yeah, how does everything I just said relate to that U.S. goal of preventing Eurasian integration?
Yeah, so this most dangerous scenario that Brzezinski was speaking about is pretty much exactly what is happening. Even a small child can understand this. Is it a smart move to antagonize the largest countries in the world simultaneously? Of course not. It's to be frank, it's very foolish. And the relationship between the West and Russia is at this stage beyond repair. I think it's fair to say, probably for decades. The relationship between the West and China is not as bad, but China is profoundly hurt by the attitude of the West, and there is very little trust left, if not none. And of course, China and Russia now have what they call a no-limits friendship. Actually, let me quote you the exact words of the joint statement that they released a couple of months back, which is, friendship between the two states has no limits. There are no forbidden areas of cooperation. So it's an extremely strong statement. But that's not it. You have Iran as well, for instance. In fact, Brzezinski's actual quote is, the most dangerous scenario would be a grand coalition of China, Russia, and perhaps Iran. So, yeah. And it's not breaking news that Iran isn't exactly on the side of the US. So this is all a consequence of American hubris, frankly. I mean, the arrogance of its actions is breathtaking when you think about it, waging endless wars all over the planet. And when it's not directly at war, it engages in extremely hostile meddling and interference like it constantly does with China or with Russia or Iran for that matter, as well as countless of other countries, maybe even all countries. So you need to be quite deluded to believe that this won't in time create immense resentment and grievances. It's basic physics. For every action, there is an opposite reaction. So it's totally predictable that as their victims pile up, they will at one point congregate and say no more. President Clinton, whom I don't often quote, of all people, he actually said something quite smart about this once after he stopped being president. In a 2003 speech at Yale University, he said that if the US could conceive of a world where they will no longer be number one, it was in their interest to create a world with rules and partnerships and habits of behavior that we would like to live in as a relatively smaller power, as number one, number two, as number two, number three, or even less. But they never tried to do this. Instead, they doubled down on hegemony, making up and changing the rules as they went along, so they benefited them. That's what they famously call the rules-based order.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're almost in that world. In fact, we're probably already in that world, since China is arguably already number one, like we spoke about earlier. And since the US didn't create a multipolar world order in which they could be a comfortable number two or number three, well, the result is that others are most likely going to take the initiative to create that new world order themselves. It just makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it really is shooting yourself in the foot, but that's what
Yeah.
empires do.